The gunshot that killed Preston Palmer's wife and daughter echoed through the canyon, so loud that he swore he could still hear it 3 months later, though the doctors told him the silence that followed was all in his shattered mind. Preston had been a different man before that autumn day in 1878, back when Murphy's, California still felt like home instead of a graveyard full of memories. He had worked the Palmer Ranch with his father since he was old enough to hold a rope, and when he married Sarah, he thought he had found the kind of happiness that songs were written about. Their daughter Emma had just turned 4, with her mother's dark curls and his gray eyes, and she loved to watch the horses run in the pasture while singing made-up songs about cowboys and clouds. They had been riding into town that afternoon, the 3 of them together in the wagon, when the bandits came out of nowhere. Preston had reached for his rifle, but there were 6 of them and they were too fast. The leader wanted the strongbox under the seat, the one with the ranch payroll Preston was taking to the bank. Preston had handed it over without hesitation, his hands raised, telling them to take whatever they wanted. But the leader had been drunk or mean or both, and when Sarah had gasped in fear, he had turned his gun on her and fired. Emma's scream had lasted only a second before another shot rang out. Preston had lunged forward, but a rifle butt to his skull had sent him into darkness. When he woke, he was in Doc Morrison's office with a bandage around his head and Sheriff Coleman sitting beside him with the worst news a man could ever hear. His wife and daughter were dead. The bandits were gone. And Preston's voice, whether from the blow to his head or the shock to his soul, had simply stopped working. The doctors said it was possible his voice would return, that sometimes trauma did strange things to the body. But 3 months had passed, and Preston had not spoken a single word. He could not even whisper. When he tried, nothing came out but air and silence. He had stopped trying after the first few weeks. What was there to say anyway? His whole world had been buried in the Murphys' cemetery on a gray October day, and the ranch that had once felt full of life now felt like a prison. His father had died 2 years before, and his mother had passed when he was young, which meant Preston lived alone now in the house he had built for Sarah. Every room held memories that cut like knives. Emma's toys still sat in the corner of the parlor. Sarah's apron still hung on the hook by the kitchen. Preston knew he should pack these things away, but he could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he avoided those rooms entirely, sleeping in the barn most nights where the horses were the only company he could stand. The ranch hands had stayed on at first, but Preston's silence had made working difficult. He communicated through gestures and notes scribbled on paper, but it was not the same as a boss who could call out orders or share a joke over supper. One by one they had drifted away to other ranches where the foreman could actually speak. Now only old Miguel remained, the Mexican ranch hand who had worked for Preston's father for 30 years. Miguel was patient with Preston's silence, seeming to understand what others could not. But even Miguel's kindness could not pull Preston out of the dark hole he had fallen into. Preston spent his days doing the bare minimum to keep the ranch running. He fed the horses, mended fences, checked the cattle, but his heart was not in it. He moved through his chores like a ghost, barely eating, barely sleeping, existing but not really living. The people in Murphy's had tried to help at first, bringing food and offering condolences, but Preston had made it clear he wanted to be left alone. He had even stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary, and when he did go, he kept his hat pulled low and avoided eye contact. It was on one of these reluctant trips to town, in late January of 1879, that Preston first saw Violet Gardner. The morning had started cold, with frost on the ground and his breath visible in the air as he hitched up the wagon. He needed supplies from the general store, things that even his stubborn isolation could not do without. Flour, coffee, salt, ammunition. He had made a list on paper the night before and tucked it into his coat pocket along with the money. Murphy's was busy for a Saturday, with wagons and horses lining Main Street and people moving between the shops. Preston tied up his horse outside Turner's general store and stepped onto the boardwalk, his shoulders hunched and his eyes down. He pushed through the door and the bell above it jingled, announcing his arrival. Mrs. Turner was behind the counter, and she gave him a sympathetic smile. She had stopped trying to make conversation with him after the first month, understanding that he could not respond. Preston handed her his list and she nodded, moving around the store to gather the items while he stood waiting. That was when he heard it, or rather, did not hear it. A woman sat on a bench near the front window of the store, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfect. She wore a simple gray dress with a black shawl, and her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was lovely in a quiet way, with high cheekbones and clear skin, but it was her stillness that caught Preston's attention. She did not fidget or look around or tap her feet like most people did when they were waiting. She simply sat, her green eyes fixed on something outside the window, and the silence around her felt almost intentional. Mrs. Turner noticed Preston looking and lowered her voice, though Preston could still hear her clearly. "That's Violet Gardner. She moved here about 2 weeks ago from San Francisco. She's staying in the boarding house and looking for work, poor thing." Preston nodded slightly to show he had heard, though he did not know why Mrs. Turner was telling him this. He watched as a man approached Violet, his hat in his hands, clearly trying to strike up a conversation. The man's mouth moved, asking questions or making comments, but Violet did not respond. She did not even turn to look at him. The man tried again, leaning closer, and this time Violet did turn her head. She looked at him directly, and Preston saw her lips move, forming words. But no sound came out. The man frowned, confused, and said something else. Again, Violet's lips moved silently. The man shook his head and walked away, muttering something that Preston could not hear but could easily imagine. Probably thought she was rude or strange, but Preston understood immediately. She could not speak either. He stood frozen in place, staring at this woman who sat in silence just as he did. It felt like looking into a mirror, seeing someone else who existed in the same soundless world he had been trapped in for 3 months. Mrs. Turner returned with his supplies, breaking his focus, and he forced himself to look away. He paid with cash, gathered his packages, and headed for the door. As he passed Violet's bench, she turned her head and their eyes met. Hers were the color of spring grass, bright and clear. And for just a moment Preston felt something crack in the wall he had built around himself. She gave him the smallest nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them, and then looked away. Preston stepped outside and loaded his supplies into the wagon, his hands moving automatically while his mind stayed on the woman in the gray dress. He told himself it was just surprise at meeting someone else who could not speak. That was all, nothing more. He climbed onto the wagon seat and drove out of town without looking back. But over the next few days, he found himself thinking about Violet Gardner more than he wanted to admit. He wondered why she could not speak. Had she been born that way, or had something happened to her like it had to him? And why had she come to Murphy's from San Francisco? The city was a world away from this small mining town in the Sierra Nevada foothills. He tried to push the questions away, focusing on his work and his grief. But they kept creeping back in during the quiet moments, when he was alone in the barn or staring at the ceiling at night. 2 weeks later, Miguel mentioned that he had heard the boarding house was looking for someone to cook and clean since Mrs. Patterson, who ran the place, was getting too old to manage all the work herself. They hired that new woman, Miguel said in Spanish, which Preston understood well enough. The one who cannot speak. Mrs. Patterson says she is a hard worker. Preston nodded and went back to fixing the broken stall door, but his mind was elsewhere. So Violet had found work. Good for her. It was not his concern, except that it was, somehow. He could not explain why. Another week passed before Preston returned to town. He told himself he needed nails and new leather for a harness, but the truth was that he wanted to see if Violet was still there. He felt foolish for it, like a boy with a schoolyard crush, but he could not seem to stop himself. He found her outside the boarding house, sweeping the front steps. She moved with efficiency and grace, her focus on the task at hand. Preston tied up his horse across the street and pretended to check the saddle while watching her from the corner of his eye. A group of miners walked past, and one of them called out to her, something crude that made the others laugh. Violet did not react. She kept sweeping as if she had not heard them at all. The miner called out again, louder this time, but still Violet ignored him. Annoyed, the miner walked up the steps and grabbed her arm. Preston was moving before he realized he had made a decision. He crossed the street in long strides and climbed the steps, putting himself between Violet and the miner. Up close, the man reeked of whiskey and sweat. Preston stared at him hard, his jaw set, his hands relaxed but ready. The miner scowled. "This ain't your business, friend." Preston did not move. He just kept staring, his gray eyes cold. "I was just trying to talk to the lady," the miner said, his tone defensive now. "No harm in that." Preston took one step forward, closing the distance between them. He was tall, just over 6 feet, and broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work. The miner was smaller and clearly drunk. The confrontation lasted only a few seconds before the miner raised his hands and backed away. "Fine, fine. Crazy mute woman ain't worth the trouble anyway." He stumbled down the steps and rejoined his friends, who pulled him away while shooting dark looks back at Preston. Preston turned to Violet, expecting to see fear or gratitude or something in her expression. Instead, she looked at him with calm assessment, her green eyes steady. She set the broom aside and held up one hand, palm out, in a gesture that clearly meant wait. Then she disappeared inside the boarding house. Preston stood on the steps, uncertain. Should he leave? Had he offended her somehow by interfering? But before he could decide, she returned with a small slate and a piece of chalk. She wrote quickly and held it up for him to read. "Thank you, but I can handle men like that." Preston almost smiled. Almost. He pulled out the small notebook he carried for communication and wrote his own response. "I am sure you can, but you should not have to." Violet read his words, and something softened in her expression. She erased her slate and wrote again. "You are Preston Palmer. I heard about what happened to you. I am sorry." The mention of Sarah and Emma sent the familiar spike of pain through his chest, but he nodded in acknowledgement. He wrote, "And you are Violet Gardner. Why can you not speak?" She hesitated, her chalk hovering over the slate. For a moment Preston thought she would not answer. Then she wrote, slowly and carefully, "I choose not to." Preston frowned. That was not what he had expected. He wrote, "Why?" Violet looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether he deserved the truth. Then she wrote, "Because words are dangerous. They can hurt worse than any weapon. I learned that the hard way." Preston wanted to ask more, to understand what she meant, but Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Violet, dear, I need your help with the linens." "Oh, hello, Mr. Palmer. How are you doing?" Preston nodded politely and tipped his hat. Mrs. Patterson had always been kind to him, even when others in town treated him with pity or awkwardness. Violet gave him one last look, something unreadable in her eyes, and then followed Mrs. Patterson inside. Preston walked back to his horse, his mind spinning. She chose not to speak. What did that mean? What had happened to her that made silence seem better than words? He found himself returning to town more often after that. He always had an excuse, some supply he needed or some business to attend to, but the truth was he wanted to see Violet. He did not approach her directly, not wanting to disturb her work or make her uncomfortable. He just watched from a distance, noticing the way she moved through her day with quiet competence. Sometimes she noticed him watching and would give him a small nod. Once, when he was loading supplies into his wagon, she walked past on an errand and paused long enough to hand him a folded piece of paper. He waited until she was gone to open it. The roses by the church are blooming. They are beautiful this time of year. It was such a simple observation, so normal and everyday, and yet it made something loosen in Preston's chest. He tucked the note into his pocket and rode out to the church that afternoon. Sure enough, the roses were in full bloom, their red petals bright against the white fence. He stood there for a long time, just looking at them, and for the first time since the shooting, he felt something other than grief. Spring turned into early summer, and Preston found himself leaving notes for Violet in return. Nothing personal or forward, just small observations about the weather or the town or the ranch. He would leave them at the general store or the boarding house, and Violet would find them and write back. It became a silent conversation, two people who could not speak finding a way to connect anyway. One day in June, Preston left a note that said, "Would you like to see the ranch? I have horses that might interest you." Violet's response came the next day. "Yes, Sunday afternoon." Preston's heart beat faster as he wrote back, "I will pick you up at 2." He spent the days leading up to Sunday cleaning the ranch house for the first time in months. He packed away Emma's toys, folded Sarah's apron and put it in a trunk, swept the floors and washed the windows. Miguel watched with approval but said nothing, understanding that this was something Preston needed to do on his own. Sunday arrived clear and warm. Preston hitched the wagon and drove into town, his hands sweating despite the bandana he used to wipe them. He pulled up in front of the boarding house at exactly 2 o'clock and climbed down. Violet was waiting on the porch, wearing a simple green dress that matched her eyes. She had a small basket with her, and when Preston raised an eyebrow in question, she held up her slate. "I made biscuits. Thought we could have a picnic." Preston nodded and helped her into the wagon, his hand briefly touching hers. Even that small contact sent a jolt through him, a reminder that he was still alive despite everything. The ride to the ranch took 30 minutes, and they spent it in comfortable silence. Preston pointed out landmarks along the way, and Violet watched everything with interest, occasionally writing a question on her slate. When they arrived at the ranch, Preston helped her down and led her first to the barn. The horses nickered in greeting as they entered, and Violet's face lit up with genuine delight. She moved from stall to stall, reaching out to stroke soft noses and whisper soundless words that the horses seemed to understand. Preston watched her, seeing a joy in her expression that he had not seen before. She stopped at the last stall, where a gray mare stood with her new foal. The baby was only a week old, all long legs and curiosity. Violet looked at Preston with a question in her eyes, and he nodded permission. She carefully entered the stall and knelt down, letting the foal sniff her hands. The mare watched but did not seem concerned, and after a moment the foal nuzzled against Violet's shoulder. Preston leaned against the stall door, watching them. There was something healing about this moment, about seeing life and gentleness after so much death and pain. When Violet finally emerged from the stall, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, though she was smiling. They walked through the rest of the ranch, Preston showing her the pastures and the cattle and the garden that Sarah had planted, and that Preston had tried to keep alive. Violet wrote notes asking questions about the operation, and Preston found himself writing longer responses than he had given anyone in months, explaining the work and the challenges, and even some of the history. When the sun started to dip lower, they settled under a large oak tree on a rise that overlooked the valley. Violet unpacked the basket, revealing not just biscuits but also cheese, apples, and a jar of lemonade. They ate in companionable silence, passing the jar back and forth and watching the light change across the landscape. Eventually, Violet pulled out her slate and wrote, "This is a beautiful place, but it must be hard to live here now." Preston nodded. He wrote, "Every corner has a memory. Sometimes I think I should sell it and leave, but it is all I have left of them." Violet read his words and reached out, placing her hand over his. It was the first time she had touched him intentionally, and the warmth of her palm against his skin felt like an anchor. She wrote with her other hand, awkwardly but legibly, "Memories are not the same as a prison. They are proof that love existed." Preston looked at her, really looked at her, and saw that she understood. Whatever had happened to her, whatever had driven her into silence, she knew what it was like to carry pain. He wrote, "What happened to you, Violet? Why did you choose silence?" She withdrew her hand and stared at the slate for a long time. Preston waited, not pushing, giving her the space to decide. Finally, she began to write, erasing and starting over several times. "I was engaged to a man in San Francisco. His name was Richard. He was charming and handsome, and everyone said I was lucky, but after we were engaged, he changed. He became controlling, jealous. He told me what to wear, who I could see, what I could say. When I tried to speak up, he would twist my words and make me feel stupid. He was very good at that, making me doubt myself." She paused to wipe the slate and continued. "One night I told him I wanted to end the engagement. He became enraged. He said terrible things, and when I tried to leave, he grabbed me. We fought. I hit my head on a table and everything went black." Preston's hands clenched into fists as he read, anger rising hot in his chest. Violet kept writing. "When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Richard told everyone I had fallen, that it was an accident. My family believed him because he was so convincing, but I knew the truth. And I decided then that if my words could be used against me, if speaking up could lead to that kind of danger, then I would not speak any more. I broke the engagement, left San Francisco, and came here. I chose silence because it feels safer than taking the risk." She set down the chalk and looked at Preston, her eyes vulnerable but steady. Preston understood now. She had not lost her voice like he had. She had given it up as protection, a shield against being hurt again. He wrote, "I am sorry that happened to you. No one should have to make that choice." Violet nodded and wrote back, "And you should not have lost your family. Life is not fair." They sat together as the sun set, two damaged people who had found an unexpected connection in their shared silence. Preston felt something shifting inside him, a crack in the wall of grief that had surrounded him for so long. He was not ready to let go of Sarah and Emma, and he knew he never really would. But sitting here with Violet, he realized that maybe he did not have to spend the rest of his life alone in the dark. Over the following weeks, Violet came to the ranch often. Preston would pick her up on Sunday afternoons, and they would spend hours together, sometimes working side by side as she helped with small tasks, other times just sitting and writing notes back and forth. Violet had a sharp wit that came through in her writing, and Preston found himself almost laughing more than once at her observations about the townspeople or her stories from the boarding house. Miguel approved of Violet immediately. "She is good for you, patron," he said one evening in Spanish. "You are coming back to life." Preston wanted to argue, but he knew Miguel was right. He was eating regular meals again, sleeping in the house instead of the barn, even thinking about the future instead of just surviving day to day. And it was because of Violet. One evening in July, after a long day of mending fences together, Preston and Violet sat on the porch of the ranch house watching the stars come out. Violet had been unusually quiet, her slate untouched beside her. Finally, she picked it up and wrote something, then hesitated before showing it to him. "You ever wish you could speak again?" Preston considered the question carefully. He wrote, "At first I wanted nothing more. I tried everything to make the words come back, but now I am not sure. The silence has become part of me. It feels like if I speak again, I would have to face everything I have been avoiding." Violet nodded slowly. She wrote, "I understand that. Sometimes I think about speaking again too, but I am afraid." "Afraid of what?" Preston wrote. "That if I speak, I will say the wrong thing, or that I will let someone in and they will hurt me again. The silence keeps me safe." Preston set down his pencil and reached for Violet's hand. She let him take it, her fingers curling around his. He picked up his pencil again with his free hand and wrote, awkwardly but legibly, "You are safe with me." Violet looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Then she leaned forward and rested her head against his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, while the night deepened around them. That moment marked a turning point in their relationship. They were no longer just two silent people finding comfort in each other's company. They were falling in love, though neither of them had written those words yet. Preston began courting Violet properly after that, as much as two people who could not speak could court. He brought her wildflowers and left them at the boarding house. She made him meals and brought them to the ranch in covered baskets. They went for rides through the countryside, exploring the hills and valleys around Murphy's, always communicating through their notes and gestures. The townspeople watched this courtship with curiosity and speculation. Some thought it was sweet, two broken people finding happiness together. Others thought it was strange, wondering how a relationship could work without words. But Preston and Violet did not care what anyone thought. They had found something real and precious, and that was all that mattered. In August, Preston took Violet to the cemetery. He had not been there since the funeral, unable to face the graves. But with Violet beside him, he found the strength. They stood before the two headstones, and Preston felt the familiar grief wash over him, but it was different now. Less sharp. More like a deep sadness than a cutting pain. Violet squeezed his hand and wrote on her slate, "Tell me about them." So Preston wrote pages and pages in his notebook about Sarah and Emma. About Sarah's laugh and her kindness and the way she hummed while she cooked. About Emma's imagination and her fearlessness and her love of horses. About the life they had built together and the future they had planned. Violet read every word, and when she looked up, there were tears on her cheeks. She wrote, "They were lucky to have you, and you were lucky to have them. That love does not disappear just because they are gone." Preston nodded, his own eyes wet. He wrote, "I know. I am starting to understand that." They sat by the graves for an hour, Violet's hand in his, and when they finally left, Preston felt lighter. He had not forgotten Sarah and Emma, would never forget them. But he had taken a step toward accepting that they were gone and that he was still here, still living. That night back at the ranch, Preston and Violet sat on the porch as they often did. The air was warm and full of cricket song. Violet had been writing something on her slate for several minutes, erasing and starting over. Finally, she turned it to him. "I think I am falling in love with you. Is that wrong? So soon after everything you lost? Preston's heart hammered in his chest as he read the words. He wrote back, "It has been almost a year, and I think Sarah would want me to be happy again. She was not the kind of person who would want me to mourn forever." "And Emma," Violet wrote. "Emma would have loved you," Preston wrote. "She would have followed you around and talked your ear off and shown you her favorite hiding spots." Violet smiled through her tears. She wrote, "I wish I could have met them." "Me too," Preston wrote. Then, taking a deep breath, he added, "I am falling in love with you too, Violet. I did not think I could feel this way again, but you have brought light back into my life." Violet set down her slate and cupped Preston's face in her hands. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and gentle. Preston's arms came around her, pulling her close, and for several long moments they simply held each other. When they pulled apart, both of them were crying and smiling at the same time. Violet picked up her slate and wrote, "What do we do now?" Preston wrote back, "We keep going. Together." And that was exactly what they did. As the summer turned to fall, Preston and Violet's relationship deepened. They spent every Sunday together and many evenings as well. Preston taught Violet to ride the gray mare, and she proved to be a natural horsewoman. Violet cooked meals in the ranch house kitchen, filling it with warmth and good smells for the first time in a year. They worked side by side on the ranch, communicating with gestures and looks and the occasional written note when needed. In September, Preston asked Violet to marry him. He did it simply, on a Sunday afternoon ride. They had stopped by a stream to let the horses drink, and Preston pulled out his notebook. He had thought about how to phrase this for days, wanting to get it exactly right. "Violet, you have given me a reason to live again. I love you more than I can express in these written words. Will you marry me and make this ranch a home again?" Violet read the proposal with shaking hands. She looked at Preston, her eyes bright with joy, and nodded vigorously. Then she grabbed her slate and wrote, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Preston pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. He slipped it onto Violet's finger and it fit perfectly. They kissed there by the stream, the horses grazing peacefully nearby, the water burbling over stones. They set the wedding for November, giving Violet time to make a dress and Preston time to fix up the house even more. The whole town was invited, though they would have a small ceremony since neither of them could speak their vows. Instead, they would sign their names in the register and let that be their promise. The night before the wedding, Preston could not sleep. He lay in bed thinking about Sarah and Emma, about the life he had lost and the new life he was about to begin. He felt guilty for being happy, as if joy was a betrayal of his first family. But then he remembered what Violet had written all those months ago. Memories are proof that love existed. Sarah and Emma had been real and he had loved them and they had loved him. That would never change. But that did not mean he could not love again. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, perfect November weather. Miguel had helped Preston get dressed in his best suit, and now Preston stood at the front of the small church, his hands sweating despite the chill. Sheriff Coleman stood beside him as his best man, and Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row ready to stand with Violet. When the church doors opened and Violet appeared, Preston's breath caught. She wore a simple ivory dress that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was down for once, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She carried a bouquet of late-blooming roses and her cheeks were flushed with happiness. She walked down the aisle slowly, her eyes locked on Preston's. When she reached him, he took her hands and they stood facing each other before the Reverend. Reverend Thomas had adapted the ceremony for them, understanding their unique situation. He spoke the traditional words, but when it came time for the vows, he simply asked, Do you, Preston Palmer, take Violet Gardner to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Preston nodded and signed his name in the register that the Reverend held. "And do you, Violet Gardner, take Preston Palmer to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Violet nodded and signed her name beside Preston's, her hand steady. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Preston pulled Violet close and kissed her deeply, and the small congregation erupted in applause. They walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, faces glowing with joy. The reception was held at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing. Preston and Violet had their first dance, moving together in silence while the fiddle player played a waltz. It was awkward at first. Neither of them experienced dancers, but they found their rhythm, and soon they were lost in each other, the rest of the world fading away. As the evening wore on, guests came up to offer congratulations and best wishes. Most spoke out loud, not expecting responses, but a few had learned to write notes. Old Miguel embraced Preston and whispered in Spanish, "Your father would be proud of you. You have honored his memory and built a new future." When it was finally time to leave, Preston and Violet climbed into the wagon and drove back to the ranch under a sky full of stars. The house was waiting, warm and welcoming, and when they crossed the threshold together, Preston felt a sense of rightness that he had not felt in over a year. That night, in the bedroom that Preston had shared with Sarah, he and Violet came together as husband and wife. It was tender and sweet and a little awkward, but it was theirs. Afterward, they lay wrapped in each other's arms, and Violet wrote on the slate she kept by the bed, "I love you, Preston Palmer." He wrote back in the dim lamplight, "I love you too, Violet Palmer." Life settled into a new normal after the wedding. Violet moved into the ranch full-time, bringing her few possessions from the boarding house. She threw herself into making the house a home, sewing new curtains, planting a vegetable garden, and even convincing Preston to get a dog. They found a stray mutt in town, half-starved and scared, and brought him home. Violet named him Whisper, which seemed fitting for a dog owned by two silent people. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in December and temperatures dropping below freezing. Preston and Violet spent the long evenings by the fire, reading or sewing or simply sitting together. They had developed a language all their own, understanding each other through looks and touches, and the occasional written word. Christmas arrived and Violet decorated the house with pine boughs and ribbons. She baked cookies and roasted a goose, determined to make the holiday special. Preston gave her a new slate, this one with a polished wooden frame, and she gave him a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue. They exchanged their gifts on Christmas morning and then went to visit the cemetery, laying flowers on Sarah and Emma's graves. It was bittersweet but important, a way of honoring the past while living in the present. In January of 1880, a full year after Preston had first seen Violet in the general store, something unexpected happened. They were working in the barn together, Preston repairing a broken wagon wheel while Violet cleaned tack. It was cold, but they had a small fire going in a metal drum, and the horses provided extra warmth. Preston was concentrating on hammering a nail when he smashed his thumb instead. The pain was immediate and intense, and without thinking, he yelled, "Damn it!" The sound of his own voice shocked him so much that he dropped the hammer. He stood frozen, his eyes wide. Violet stared at him from across the barn, her mouth open. Preston touched his throat, feeling the vibration there. He tried again, tentatively. "Violet." The word came out rough and scratchy from disuse, but it was definitely a word, a spoken word. His voice had returned. Violet set down the piece of leather she was holding and walked toward him slowly, as if afraid he might disappear. She stood in front of him, her eyes searching his face. Preston cleared his throat and tried again. "I can speak. My voice is back." The words felt strange in his mouth, almost foreign, but they were there. Tears began streaming down Violet's face. She reached out and touched his lips with her fingers as if needing physical proof. Preston caught her hand and held it. "I did not think this would happen," he said, his voice getting stronger with each word. "The doctors said it might never come back." Violet pulled out her slate and wrote with shaking hands, "I am so happy for you." Preston looked at his wife, at the tears on her cheeks and the joy in her eyes, and felt something shift inside him. For over a year he had been silent, trapped in his grief and trauma. But Violet had sat in that silence with him, never pushing him to be anything other than what he was. She had loved him without words, and in doing so had given him a reason to want to speak again. "Thank you," Preston said softly, "for everything, for being patient with me, for loving me when I was broken." Violet shook her head and wrote, "You were never broken, just hurt. There is a difference." Preston pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "Will you speak again too?" he asked. "Now that I can," Violet pulled back and looked at him seriously. She wrote, "I don't know, I am still afraid." "I understand," Preston said, and he did. Just because his voice had returned did not mean hers would or should. Their situations were different. His silence had been involuntary, a physical and psychological response to trauma. Hers was a choice, a protection. She would speak again when and if she was ready, and not before. Over the next few weeks, Preston slowly reintegrated his voice into daily life. It felt strange at first, talking after so long without it. His voice was rusty and sometimes cracked, but it got stronger with use. He talked to the horses, to Miguel, to Whisper the dog. And most of all, he talked to Violet. He told her stories about his childhood, about his parents, about the early days of the ranch. He described what he was feeling, articulating emotions that had been trapped inside for so long. And Violet listened, her green eyes attentive, sometimes writing responses and sometimes just nodding or smiling. The townspeople were amazed when they heard that Preston could speak again. Some called it a miracle. Others said time had simply done its healing work. Preston did not care what they called it. He just knew that he was grateful. One evening in March, Preston and Violet were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. Spring was coming, bringing new life to the ranch. The trees were budding and the wildflowers were starting to bloom. Violet had her slate in her lap but had not written anything in a while. She seemed deep in thought. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked gently. Violet picked up her chalk and wrote, "I am thinking that maybe I have been silent long enough." Preston's heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" She erased the slate and wrote again, more slowly this time. "I have been afraid for so long, afraid that if I speak I will be hurt again, but watching you find your voice has made me realize something. Silence protected me, but it also trapped me. Maybe it is time to take the risk." "You do not have to," Preston said. "I love you exactly as you are." "I know," Violet wrote, "but I want to try for me. Not because anyone is making me, but because I am ready." Preston took her hand. "Then I will be right here beside you no matter what." Violet set down the slate and closed her eyes. Preston could see her concentrating, gathering her courage. Her lips moved, forming shapes, and then, so quietly he almost missed it, a sound emerged. Preston. His name spoken in a voice that was soft and a little hoarse but undeniably real. Violet's eyes flew open in shock, as if she could not believe she had actually done it. Preston squeezed her hand encouragingly. "Say it again," he urged. Violet took a breath. "Preston." Stronger this time, more confident, Preston laughed, a sound of pure joy, and pulled her into his arms. "Your voice is beautiful," he said. "I have been waiting so long to hear it." Violet clung to him, her shoulders shaking. When she pulled back, there were tears on her face, but she was smiling. "It feels strange," she said, her words careful and deliberate, "like learning to walk again." "It will get easier," Preston promised, "just like it did for me." And it did. Over the following weeks and months, Violet slowly began to use her voice more, at first just with Preston in the safety of their home, then with Miguel, who cried when he heard her speak for the first time. Eventually, she began speaking in town, though she was still careful, still choosing her words with consideration. The change in Violet was remarkable. As she reclaimed her voice, she also reclaimed a confidence that had been beaten down by Richard. She stood taller, smiled more freely, engaged with the world in a way she had not been able to before. And Preston loved watching her blossom. In May, Violet told Preston she was pregnant. She said it out loud, her voice clear and sure. "We are going to have a baby." Preston whooped with joy and spun her around, then immediately set her down gently, afraid he had been too rough. Violet laughed, a sound that was still new and precious to Preston's ears. "I am not made of glass," she said, "but yes, we are going to have a baby." In December, if Doc Morrison is right. The news brought a complicated mix of emotions for Preston. He was thrilled at the thought of being a father again, but he also felt the old grief rise up. Emma would have been 6 now if she had lived. She would have been so excited to have a little brother or sister. Sarah would have been glowing with happiness, already planning and preparing. Violet saw the shadow cross Preston's face and took his hand. "It is all right to feel sad and happy at the same time," she said gently. "This baby does not replace Emma any more than I replace Sarah. We are building something new, but that does not erase what came before." Preston nodded, his throat tight. "You always know exactly what to say." "Well, I had a lot of practice thinking about it before I could say it out loud," Violet said with a small smile. As Violet's pregnancy progressed, the ranch felt more alive than it had in years. Violet sang while she worked, old songs that she remembered from childhood. Preston talked to the baby constantly, his hand on Violet's growing belly, telling stories and making promises. They prepared the spare bedroom as a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and building a cradle out of oak. In November, a letter arrived from San Francisco. Violet's hands shook as she opened it, and Preston stood close by, ready to support her. It was from her sister Margaret, who Violet had not spoken to since leaving the city. "Dear Violet," the letter read, "I hope this finds you well. Mother told me where you had gone and I wanted to reach out. I am sorry I did not believe you about Richard. After you left, other women came forward with similar stories. He has been arrested and charged. I should have listened to you from the start. I hope you can forgive me. Please write back if you are willing. Your loving sister, Margaret." Violet read the letter aloud to Preston, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. When she finished, she looked at him. "I want to write back. I want to tell her about us, about the baby, about the life I have here." "Then you should," Preston said. "Family is important, even when it is complicated." Violet wrote a long letter that evening, telling Margaret everything. About Murphy's, about Preston, about finding her voice again. She sealed it with wax and Preston rode to town to post it the next day. 3 weeks later, Margaret wrote back, her words full of joy and relief and hope for reconciliation. On December 15, 1880, during a gentle snowfall, Violet gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The labor was long and difficult, but Violet was strong, and Doc Morrison was experienced. When Preston finally heard his son's first cry, he felt a rush of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked him over. Relief, joy, love, and a bittersweet ache for the daughter he had lost. Violet was exhausted but radiant as the doctor placed the baby in her arms. She looked at Preston with so much love in her eyes that he felt his heart might burst. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Preston approached the bed and looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant. He had dark hair like Violet and a strong grip when Preston offered his finger. "He is perfect," Preston whispered. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Violet asked. They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Preston knew exactly what felt right. "Peter," he said. "Peter James Palmer. After my father and your father." Violet smiled through her tears. "Peter. I love it. Hello, Peter. Welcome to the world." The first few months with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful and chaotic. Peter was a good baby for the most part, though he had strong lungs when he wanted something. Preston and Violet took turns with the night feedings, stumbling through the dark house half asleep. Miguel helped where he could, entertaining the baby while Violet caught up on rest or Preston worked. As winter turned to spring, Peter grew and changed, his features becoming more distinct. He had Violet's green eyes and Preston's strong jaw. He smiled early at just 6 weeks, and his laugh was the best sound Preston had ever heard. One April evening, Preston came in from the fields to find Violet sitting in the rocking chair with Peter, singing a lullaby. Her voice was soft and sweet, and Preston stood in the doorway just listening. When she finished, she looked up and saw him there. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked with a smile. "Long enough," Preston said, crossing the room to kiss her forehead. "You have a beautiful voice, Violet. I am so glad you decided to use it again." "Me too," Violet said. "I was so afraid for so long, but you showed me that it was possible to heal, to move forward even after terrible things happen. You gave me courage." "We gave each other courage," Preston corrected. "I could not have done it without you." Peter squirmed in Violet's arms and let out a little cry. Preston scooped him up and held him against his shoulder, patting his back gently. "Someone is hungry," he said, "or needs a new diaper, possibly both." Violet laughed and stood up, stretching. "I will handle the feeding if you handle the diaper." "Deal," Preston said. They worked together as they did everything, a team bound by love and mutual respect and the shared experience of overcoming darkness. As Preston changed Peter's diaper and Violet prepared to nurse him, he thought about how far they had both come. 2 years ago he had been a broken man who could not speak, lost in grief, and seeing no future. Now he was a husband and father again, running a successful ranch, looking toward tomorrow with hope instead of dread. It had not been easy. The road to healing never was. But they had walked it together, hand in hand, learning to speak again in more ways than one. In the years that followed, the Palmer Ranch thrived. Preston expanded the cattle operation and began breeding horses, building a reputation for quality stock throughout the region. Violet became known for her skill with difficult horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals with patience and understanding. Together they built a life of purpose and meaning. Peter grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch as much as his parents did. In 1883, Violet gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Preston's first wife. It had been Violet's idea, a way of honoring the woman who had come before and ensuring her memory lived on. The new Sarah had her namesake's dark curls and sweet temperament, and Preston often found himself smiling through tears when he looked at her. Another son, Michael, arrived in 1885, completing their family. The house that had once been so full of silence and sorrow now rang with children's laughter and conversation. Preston and Violet still valued quiet moments together, but they had learned that silence and speech could coexist, that both had their place. Margaret came to visit in the summer of 1886, traveling from San Francisco with her husband and 2 children. The reunion between the sisters was tearful and joyful, years of hurt beginning to heal. Margaret's children and Preston's children became fast friends, and the two families remained close from that point on. Preston sometimes visited the cemetery, bringing the children to lay flowers on the graves of Sarah and Emma. He told them stories about their older sister and their father's first wife, making sure those memories stayed alive. Peter and Sarah and Michael understood that love was not limited, that their father's heart was big enough to hold all of them, the living and the dead. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston and Violet sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching their children play in the yard. Peter was 12 now, tall and responsible, helping his father with the ranch work. Sarah was 7, clever and kind, following her mother everywhere. Michael was 5, adventurous and fearless, always getting into some kind of mischief. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Violet asked, her hand in Preston's. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Preston said. "Other times it feels like we have always been together." "I am glad we found each other," Violet said. "Even though the circumstances were so difficult, I cannot imagine my life without you." "Neither can I," Preston said. He squeezed her hand and looked at her, this woman who had saved him in so many ways. "You taught me that it was possible to love again, to live again. When I lost Sarah and Emma, I thought my life was over, but you showed me it was just a new chapter beginning." Violet leaned her head against his shoulder. "And you taught me that words have power, but only if we let them. You taught me that silence can be peaceful instead of fearful, and that speaking up is worth the risk." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the land they loved, surrounded by the life they had built. It had not been the path either of them expected, but it had led them to exactly where they needed to be. Preston thought about the young man he had been, before the tragedy that had stolen his voice and his hope. That man was gone, transformed by grief and loss into someone different. But from the ashes of that pain, something new had grown, something stronger and deeper and more resilient. He looked at Violet, at the woman who had sat in silence with him until he was ready to speak again, who had loved him through the darkness and helped him find the light. She had been silent herself, protecting her wounded heart, and together they had healed each other in ways neither could have managed alone. "I love you," Preston said, the words coming easily now, no longer strange or difficult. "I love you too," Violet replied, her voice clear and sure. And in the laughter of their children, in the solid presence of the house and land, in the quiet strength of their clasped hands, that love was evident. It had grown from silence and pain into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of patience, understanding, and hope. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Whisper the dog dozed at their feet, gray-muzzled now but still faithful. The horses nickered softly in the barn. The evening breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh hay. Preston Palmer had lost everything once, his voice stolen by tragedy along with his family and his will to live. Violet Gardner had chosen silence to protect herself from more pain, building walls that she thought could never come down. But they had found each other in that silence, two broken souls who recognized their shared wounds. And together, through love and patience and courage, they had learned to speak again, to live again, to hope again. Their story was not one of forgetting the past or pretending pain had never existed. It was a story of moving forward while carrying those memories, of building a new life without erasing the old one. It was a story of healing that honored the scars, of love that made room for all the complicated emotions that came with loss and survival. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Preston and Violet called their children inside for dinner. The family gathered around the table, hands joining for grace, and when Preston spoke the blessing, his voice was steady and full of gratitude. They ate and talked and laughed together, a family bound not just by blood, but by the understanding that life could be hard and beautiful all at once. Later, after the children were tucked into bed and the house had grown quiet, Preston and Violet stood together in their bedroom. Violet unpinned her hair and let it fall around her shoulders while Preston pulled off his boots. These simple domestic rituals had become sacred over the years, reminders of the ordinary magic of sharing a life with someone. "Thank you," Preston said suddenly, and Violet turned to look at him with a questioning expression. "For not giving up on me, for seeing something worth saving when I could not see it myself." Violet crossed the room and took his face in her hands. "You did the same for me." "We saved each other, Preston. That is what love does." She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And when they lay down together, wrapped in each other's arms, they spoke in whispers of their dreams for the future, of the children and the ranch and the years still ahead of them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees and the creek babbled over stones and the land stretched out in all directions, wild and beautiful and home. The Palmer Ranch had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, but it had endured, just like the people who lived there. Preston drifted off to sleep with Violet's heartbeat steady beneath his ear, and a sense of peace that had once seemed impossible. His tragedy had indeed stolen his voice and his hope, leaving him lost in silence and darkness. But Violet had sat in that silence with him, patient and unwavering, until he found the strength to speak again. And in speaking, in choosing to live and love once more, he had helped her find her own voice, her own courage, her own hope. Together they had built something lasting from the broken pieces of their past. Together they had proven that healing was possible, that love could bloom even in the hardest soil, that tomorrow always held the promise of something better. And together they would face whatever the future brought, side by side, voice to voice, heart to heart, until the very end of their days.